if we can get to our hearts and feel the sorrow, and I think that's what most people resist when they are in denial of collapse. They're resisting the work that needs to be done to accept it. And then in the process of accepting, it's just very human for us to say, so what can I do? What's my role here? How can I serve? How can I make a difference here in some way? I can't stop it. It's inevitable, but I can soften it. I can lessen the blows. I can make this situation over here a little easier. I can bring joy. I can take my pain and from it create all kinds of things, not just art, but gardens and new ways of being in the world.
So it's such a pleasure to be here talking with Carolyn Baker today. She is, for me and many, I imagine, considered an elder in this space for how long she's been talking about collapse and ecological collapse and civilizational collapse. And for those that don't know her, she was a psychotherapist for 17 years and a professor of psychology and history for 10. She's a prolific writer and the author of now 15 books, as well as co-authoring 4 with Andrew Harvey. She has also, for about a decade, been publishing pretty much every day her Daily News Digest, which is a daily collection of news stories and inspirations focusing on the global crisis. She has said her life mission is creating islands of sanity in a sea of global chaos. To explore those islands a bit further with her, I'm here to talk to her today about her latest book, Undaunted, Living Fiercely into Climate Meltdown in an Authoritarian World. That's quite a title, and big welcome to you, Carolyn.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's great to be here. I always love chatting with you.
Me too. And look, you've said about this book, I mean, look, there's so many ways I could have entered this, but I just couldn't resist this one. You've said about this book, it's a post-term manual inviting the reader to consider the benefits of acceptance of our planetary predicament. So I guess we'll start from the beginning and the end in there. Like, what is our predicament and what are the benefits of acceptance that you're talking about here?
Well, I suppose that I don't need to spell it out for most of your viewers and listeners, yes. But certainly we're all familiar with climate catastrophe, climate chaos. I don't call it change anymore. I call it climate chaos because we can't keep track of the changes. They're happening so quickly. So certainly climate chaos and the die-off of species, the potential extinction of the human species, the growing authoritarianism that we see in our world, which perpetuates inequality, it perpetuates destruction of the environment. And of course, speaking for those of us who live in the United States more than anywhere else, the off-the-charts violence that we are now experiencing in our country, and some other countries are as well. Many third world countries experiencing violence through revolution or turf wars and that sort of thing, where we in the United States are experiencing this chaotic violence in our culture now every day. It's a daily occurrence for us. And
it's crazy, isn't it? Yes, go on.
Yeah, it's, we're marinating almost in trauma. And even when people think, well, this isn't affecting me because I don't watch the news, I don't read the papers, I just live in my own little world. Even so, in doing that, we're still affected by it on some level. And so, trauma is the malady of our time, I believe. And I just like to say that even though those of us who are awake to collapse and have been for a long time, we know where that's going. That view from 30,000 feet is very useful in terms of the overall perspective. But I am not one of those who says, okay, we're collapsing, it's a done deal, it's happening, and I should just be paying attention to that, accept collapse, and not get involved in activism, not get involved on the ground in really trying to make changes, because it's all going to collapse anyway. I can't share that perspective. I very, very much want to have the view from 30,000 feet, but it matters to me how all of that unfolds. And does it unfold in an unimaginably brutal way, or does it unfold in a way that is less severe, less brutal? And what can I do to make that happen, if anything?
They're the ultimate questions, aren't they? And I think there is something about acceptance. It's such a double-edged sword in this case, isn't it? Because some people, I mean, look, I don't want to speak for what's right for everybody, but some people will use that as a way to disappear from the world, and some people will use that to step further into the world, and I think that's what you're encouraging us to do. But the first step is acceptance in that. How do you, I mean, just in your case, because you're so active in it, I mean, you've written some books now. You've written, since I last spoke to you, this is the second book you published, and it wasn't that long ago. So how do you come from acceptance of what's happening to the amount of action that comes out of you? Like, how does that actually happen inside of you?
So acceptance is a process, okay? That's the first thing. Let's say somebody wakes up to collapse tomorrow and they go, oh, industrial civilization is collapsing. Okay. And I feel terrible, and I'm scared, and I'm sad, and all of these different feelings. And so it's a process of all of those emotions being accepted for what they are, not being forbidden, accepting that's okay. How would I not feel all of these things in the face of such an extraordinary event? And then, over time, we become a bit more accustomed, particularly if we are willing to do grief work. If we're willing to consciously grieve these losses, and not just say, well, these losses are happening, it's too bad, and live in our heads about it. If we can get to our hearts and feel the sorrow, and I think that's what most people resist when they are in denial of collapse. They're resisting the work that needs to be done to accept it. Okay.
That's so well put. Yeah, go on.
And then in the process of accepting, it's just very human for us to say, so what can I do? What's my role here? How can I serve? How can I make a difference here in some way? I can't stop it. It's inevitable, but I can soften it. I can lessen the blows. I can make this situation over here a little easier. I can bring joy. I can take my pain and from it create all kinds of things, not just art, but gardens and new ways of being in the world. So it's all of a process, and we're all at different stages of collapse acceptance and collapse awareness.
I just think in terms of my own process, when I first was really coming into the understanding of this with Catherine Ingram, I had 2 years where I could virtually do nothing. But then out of that, came the film. So came the film and came these interviews and came all the work that I'm doing. And so it's ended up being generative, but it wasn't for a little while.
Right. Right. Yeah. For a while, it may just mean sitting in the pain of it and doing the grief work and being angry sometimes, being fearful sometimes. But of course, all of this is lessened and contained by our connections with other people. And, you know, that's why I'm so grateful for the work that Dean Walker is doing and Michael Dowd is doing, providing places online where people can come together and talk about all sorts of things related to collapse, including their feelings.
And look, one of those feelings that I want to pick up, and I want to return to grief later because it's so, I find it such a juicy kind of area to go and so informative. But another one, another feeling that I think people resist as well as sadness is fear. And you've said, I mean, look, you know, I just want to note here, you've just been through fires in your region that could have taken you out. We were going through floods here in exactly the same sort of time frame you're going to, but you talked about in relation to that, you talked about the folly of fearlessness. And I was really taken by that. Could you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. So when you were going through the floods, and this was near the last day of 2021, we had this horrible fire. I mean, it should have been snowing, right? This is winter in our hemisphere. And we have this terrible windstorm that was almost impossible to walk outside and stand upright. I mean, it was horrific. And tore all kinds of things off of people's houses. But about 10 miles from here, a spark, another maybe 10 miles away in the different direction, had ignited and just swept through this area. It was a series of custom homes and tract homes, subdivision basically, that was just completely taken out. Over 1,000 homes destroyed. Fortunately, no one was killed. I don't think anyone was killed. Several people were injured, but the property damage was phenomenal. And so I'm sitting here, hearing the wind, bash my house, and thinking, okay, this is it. You know, here it is. I can't stop pretending anymore that this is in the future. It's happening right now. There is no more fire season. Fire season is year-round now. And so I need to have some things ready in case I have to evacuate, because many people had to evacuate that day. So I need to make those logistical preparations. And oh, by the way, where would I go if I were burnt out? You know, what would I do? And I still don't know the answer to that question. I've thought about different places. I've traveled to different places to take a look, but nothing really is clear to me at this point. And I have this sense that it's going to happen eventually, because we just don't have the water that we need in the West. We are in a terrible drought, even though we've gotten some rainstorms here and there. And the last few days have been kind of eerie. It's been forecasting rain, and things will get very cloudy, maybe even a little bit of thunder. And you go, oh, it's going to rain, and nothing happens. So we have these rainy days that aren't rainy days, and it's really kind of eerie. But again, I'm looking at that as, well, this is climate chaos. You know, we just don't know. And so fear is something that I've had to learn to sit with and, you know, to allow myself to feel it in my body and not run from it, and also not drown in it. I have some practices at the end of every chapter in my book.
Yes, they're wonderful as well. Yep.
And so, you know, it's about really, really sitting with that fear. And one of the practices at the end of the fear chapter is sitting with the fear, sitting with beauty. sitting with the fear, sitting with beauty, and kind of letting your awareness and your body sensations go back and forth with those two extremes.
Mm.
And in these ways, to breathe into it, to feel it in the body, you know, it's like you don't have to run from it. There it is. You track the sensations. Then you talk about it with somebody. I'm really scared, you know, I'm really scared I'm going to lose my home. I'm going to lose my neighbors, and not deny it, but not wallow in it either. And,
because wallowing in it could create, you know, if allowed to wallow in fear, it can create a violent response. So,
absolutely.
So I love that practice you just described. Yeah.
And the other thing it can do is, if we're not willing to sit with these feelings, fear, anger, sorrow, then it can lead us to being completely in our heads and asking silly questions like, when is all this going to happen? When are we going to go extinct? When? I hate those questions, frankly.
Yes. Yes.
Because they don't come from the gut. They come from up here, and I gotta know, and I gotta know, and you know, I have to be certain, and there is no certainty in this. I have a whole chapter in the book on uncertainty, and so that's another thing we need to be able to sit with and live with, is not knowing. And that is easier, not easy, but easier if we can work with the emotions.
There was a friend of mine online, John Stevens, and I unfortunately I can't remember who he was quoting now, but he said the good news and the bad news. The bad news is we're falling, and the good news is there is no ground.
Right.
Yes. So
exactly.
To get used to that sense of uncertainty is part of it. It's, you know, uncertainty, fear, and grief are probably the three big ones, aren't they?
Yeah. And anger, and certainly,
yes.
You know, and I talk about that in the book too, that sometimes we can get very self-righteous in our anger and begin to blame all of humanity. You know, well, the rest of humanity is stupid, and why didn't they see this coming, and why didn't they stop this? You know, all of which are, I believe, defenses against the grief and the fear.
And look, the same goes, and you mentioned it in your book, and I love that you did, because the same goes for those that are seeing collapse clearly and feeling anger at the people that aren't. You know what I mean? It's the same kind. We're in the same dimension, aren't we? And I'd love you to say something about that, because there's a lot of that going on. And you know, I battle with that as well. I try not to bring it, but I battle with it.
Yeah, I don't see how we don't battle with it to some extent, because we see the insanity of worshiping fossil fuels and taking absolutely no heed to what's going on, and nations making agreements about climate change and then not following through or going against those agreements, and on and on and on. We see the destruction all around us. The abuse of animals, the abuse of people, the abuse of nature, everywhere. And it's very difficult not to feel anger, and it's okay to feel the anger. But what we do that is not useful at all is we draw a line between ourselves and those people who are not awake to collapse. And we say, well, they're stupid and they don't know what's going on, or they're at fault, and I'm just not going to have anything to do with it. Okay, I'm going to go over here to my collapsitarian friends and we're going to hang out, you know, and it's like, that's the exact opposite of what we need to be doing. I'm not saying cozy up to those folks. I'm saying, look at their humanity, because it could be us who's in denial. It could be us who refuses to see what we see. And by some grace or something that we don't understand, we have awakened. Okay. And maybe the most useful thing you can do, instead of, you know, you say perhaps you have a father, as I say in the book, my father doesn't understand collapse. Well, I'm not going to talk to him because he thinks I'm crazy and he doesn't get it. Maybe the most useful thing you could do is have a very deep conversation with your father about something that has nothing to do with collapse.
Right.
And really listen to him or her, your mother or anyone. Just listen to them and notice their facial expression and their body language. Notice what makes them sad. Notice all of the things that they're not saying with words, but is written all over them. And feel your compassion for them. And realize it could be you. I could be this person walking around in denial. They don't have a right to being stupid. It could be me. And allow yourself to feel compassion for these people. That's really difficult. That's really difficult.
Yeah, and I love that I love how you said having the grace to be awakened in these times, even though that awakening is, it's pretty shocking to see what we see. And once you see it, it's so obvious. But I love that you called it grace, because there is a real grace in it. There is something that comes in seeing the situation clearly that clears out a lot of my mind and makes things very focused into what's important.
Yeah, into what matters. And I have a whole chapter on what matters, because that's what I think we really need to be focusing on. What matters, and then what am I going to do with that?
And I just want to come back to this idea of compassion for a moment, because there was one, you mentioned it just briefly in your book, but I was like, wow, I so want to hear more about that. And I was really touched personally reading it. And you'd said that you had begged, there was a friend of yours that was begging on the street for money, and you had joined them to beg next to them. Right. And I was really moved by this story. I just wanted you to say a little bit more about that and the motivations and what happened for you in that.
Yeah. This was a friend. He's still a friend. I don't see him that much. I talk with him once in a while on the phone. A houseless person. And I got to know him and his dog about 8 years ago, and was able to help him in different practical ways. But one day, there's sometimes great wisdom comes out of him, and, he's mentally ill, so great craziness comes out of him at other times. And one day he just invited me. He said, "I'd like you to go with me and beg." And I said, okay, I'd like to do that. And I didn't know all of the feelings that would bring up for me. It was a very humbling experience, to sit in the street with this guy, and a couple of police cruisers went by, and I'm thinking, well, they could stop any moment and arrest both of us. And what would I say? Oh, I'm just with him, but I'm not really a houseless person, and I'm just doing an experiment, and, that sort of thing. And meanwhile, he goes to jail. Am I willing to sit there and do this humbling thing and get all of the looks and stares that I got, and people thinking, what's she doing with him, and maybe get arrested? Am I willing to sit here and do that and see what that's like? I did it a couple of times with him, and I'm so glad I did, and I took the little spare change that I got and gave it to him, took him to lunch one day after one of our experiences of doing that. But it was really good for me. I'll never forget it. It was extremely valuable. And only a privileged person can talk like I'm talking right now.
Yes, of course.
Because a person of color, a houseless person, it's not an experiment.
Yes, I totally hear you on that, and also I'm touched by your wanting to remove the barrier between you and him, and your willingness to experience. I mean, there is, in amongst all this fear, there is tremendous financial fear going on as well. There's financial collapse going on that's only going to get worse. How can it? It's impossible for it not to if civilization's collapsing. So there was that aspect of what you went to meet. So I'll just go to meet that fear directly, which sort of said a lot to me about your courage and who you are. I got a big insight into you in that, Carolyn. So look, the other thing that I mentioned to you in an email that I wanted to go to was one of your chapters, which I love, which you based on a cartoon that you'd seen, was I love you, son, but I love fossil fuels more. And I mean, it's funny, but it's also sort of too true to be funny. But you mentioned in that chapter, I think, or around that chapter, that the culture is decompressing into psychosis. And look, we've just had all those shootings in America. Just a couple of days ago on July the 4th. You know, Uvalde, where the kids were shot up. You know, we've got the courts. Yeah.
There was a shooting in Copenhagen yesterday. At the same time we were having the one in United States, there was one at a mall in Copenhagen. So that's rare for that to happen outside the US, but it happened.
And then so you've got these things happening. You've also got the courts in America that have been taken over by the extreme right, that are now serving a minority opinion on Roe Wade, and you know, dismantling the EPA. So this idea of cultural psychosis, I was really taken with it. I thought, oh yeah, that is. I hadn't thought about psychosis in a cultural way, but I'd love to get what is psychosis and what do you mean by cultural psychosis?
Well, psychosis is when a person has, you know, gone mad, and they lose their ability to think rationally, and they might be able to make plans and strategize, but these are all based on irrational feelings and beliefs. So the guy, for instance, in the United States, who shot up the people yesterday, it's my yesterday, planned this for several weeks, which doesn't mean he's not crazy, doesn't mean he's not psychotic, but you know, he planned this, and it didn't just erupt from him. And so with all of the trauma and chaos and madness that we're seeing in our culture, the violence, the fear, the paranoia, all of that. We're like people who are decompensating, having a nervous breakdown into complete madness and complete dysfunction of the culture.
And you know, part of me thinks as we see the cultural foundations fall, like all of the pillars that we think have been holding us are going to come down, except the really deep inner ones. But these outer structures are going to come down, and people are going to go crazy. That is what's going to happen. And yeah.
I believe that we're coming to a place in the United States, and I don't know when or where or how, but I'm feeling increasingly like we're coming to a place where it's going to be very dicey to even go outside. Where, you know, let's see, do I want to go out today and get groceries? Where would be the safest grocery store to go to? Do I need to take my gun? Oh, I don't have a gun. Well, maybe if I duck in and duck out really fast and get back home, then I'll miss some kind of violence. That kind of thinking, I think, is going to be proliferating in American culture, where it will be very uncertain when you even go outside. I mean, yesterday, amid that 4th of July parade, a number of other cities canceled their 4th of July parades. They canceled their fireworks displays. They didn't want people out in public. And so I think we're getting to a place where it's going to be increasingly dangerous. You're taking a risk, a big risk, to even go outside.
Wow.
And
Yeah, I
that, I
mean, this,
don't see
yeah,
that happening tomorrow, but I don't
yeah,
think it's that far away.
yeah. I mean, this is really where the rubber hits the road, isn't it? You know, it's one thing to talk about collapse, you know, out there. It's another thing when you start thinking in terms of it'll be too scary to leave the house. And in terms of like, so we're meeting our own minds. We're also meeting the craziness of other people's minds. And I don't know, you know, how to, I mean, look, it all comes down to how we're traveling with our inner worlds, doesn't it, really?
Yes,
Like, how are we going to meet it? And you do talk a lot about the need to do the inner work and the need to find meaning as a way to keep the internal world strong enough to meet it. And look, you have a lot of incredible quotes. I mean, look, for those that haven't read Carolyn's book, just reading the quotes at the start of each chapter is a journey in and of itself. You know, Thomas Berry, Carl Jung, Pema Chodron, Uma Hayek, Stephen Jenkinson, like, and on and on and on and on and on. But one of the quotes that you talked about was by Viktor Frankl. You can survive any what with a good enough why. And I just want to expand on this a second before you pick it up, because I had a friend that did jail time and he held on to that quote. This is some years ago now, but he held on to that quote to get him through that period. You can survive any what with a good enough why. But because he wanted to get out of jail and see his grandchildren again. He wanted to live, to be back in his family and see his grandchildren again. Now, in this case, in collapse in this way, it's not about surviving something and then being on the other side where it's all happy and good again, back to normal. There is no normal that's going to return. So I really want you to expand on that quote from that perspective, that there's no coming out back to normal at the end of it.
Yeah, you know, it was a very important awareness that Viktor Frankl had in terms of getting through his time in Auschwitz, which he had no idea if he would survive. And the rest of his family, who was imprisoned there, did not survive. And so it not only sustained him, but the search for meaning then became his whole reason for being after he was out of Auschwitz. And he developed something called logotherapy, which helped people find meaning and purpose in their own lives. And so I'm very fond of a quote by Stephen Jenkinson, which is not in the book, but I put it now at the end of all my emails.
In your next book. Oh, I saw that. That was wonderful, that quote. Anyway, yes, go on.
Yeah. So he says, you know, we're living in a very troubled time. We can see that as an affliction, or we can see that as an assignment. And what does he mean by assignment? Well, he certainly means finding meaning and purpose and working on that every day. What is my purpose in this situation? Why am I here? And throughout the book, you'll see many times I raise the questions, two very important questions. Who do I want to be? And what did I come here to do? And I find those questions to be meaning makers in my life and in the lives of many people. Is what is really important? What am I needing to let go of so that I can be who I want to be who I am called to be, and then do the service and do the activism, perhaps, that I'm being called to do. Whether it's with animals, whether it's with people, you know, it has 1,000 forms. But there is something calling all of us to find a place to put that energy of service and love and compassion and courage, which then adds, I find, to what it means to be human and why am I here?
So well put. And I you know, these meanings have got to be sort of deep in the bedrock here, because something inside of us has to operate from a place of this is more important than whether I live or whether I die here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Something that endures, something that really makes a difference. And I don't mean makes a difference in a big way, like I'm going to join Greta and jump on a boat and help her solve climate change. It's like, no, it's something that is greater than me, that is calling me, a purpose that is calling me, that will endure. Somehow it will make a difference even after I'm not here.
I mean, you talk in other books about this as well, about the Rite of Passage, and this is very along those lines, isn't it? That
I have a whole chapter on it in this book. Yeah.
yes, you do, and it's a theme in a lot of your work, and I think it's really helpful too. In a ritual, you'd normally have the expectation, whether you made it or not, you'd have the expectation that you would come out the other side into a better life.
Right.
And we, in this case, don't have that expectation. We have an initiation. We have something that we're going through, but very little chance of coming out the side, if any, out the other side, if any. So I love your distinction between sort of a traditional rite of passage and this one, if you know what I mean.
Well, my description of the rite of passage is symbolic. I mean, the real focus in when I talk about it is not the actual ritual, the actual ceremony that indigenous cultures have participated in for thousands of years. It's like, how do we take this model and apply it to ourselves? And the coming through doesn't necessarily mean that we will literally survive. Maybe it means that we don't survive, but in the process, we're able to look back in some way. I don't know how that would be, but in some way, we're able to look back and say, I did what was required of me. I answered the call. I lived my life according to who do I want to be and what did I come here to do. And so my initiation is complete, whether I survive physically or not.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. And certainly, you're someone who, incredible how much work you generate, Carolyn. And, you're also offering sessions for people now. I'm presuming one-on-one.
Yes.
For people to help find that purpose and that place in themselves. Is that, do you have a lot of people coming to see you for that?
Well, I do now more than I have in the past. And some people come for spiritual guidance, spiritual counseling, because they want to go deeper with, these questions of meaning and purpose. And actually in the fall, and I'll be advertising this online and pretty much everywhere, and certainly on Facebook and other media, I'm going to be having a study group on Undaunted.
Oh, great.
That will take place from late September, that goes into early November. About 8 weeks of studying Undaunted, where we will come together and have a lot of discussion, breakout groups, and go deep into certain subjects each time, where people can really feel that they have a place to share and support each other.
This you do, as well as really supporting people into action and purpose and focus. Around what they want to give in these times, and that's one of the ways that I find you most inspiring. And I think so many people, like one of the questions that you said that you ask everybody that comes to see you is, what do you believe this crisis is asking of you? And so what do you do? For me personally, that answer just arrived when it arrived. And I feel tremendously lucky that I got an answer, you know, I wasn't particularly even asking for one, and it just came. And I do feel blessed in that regard, graced in that regard.
Right.
But what do you do with people that recognize what's happening, but they can find nothing, they feel no call to act? And how do you work with people like that?
Well, usually they can't answer that question because they're feeling all of these emotions, the fear, the grief, the anger. And so we might need to work through those emotions so that they're not paralyzed by them. And they kind of get a little bit of clearing. It's like, oh, okay, I'm not done with those emotions. I still feel them, but there's more. There's more than just those emotions. And let's see, what might that be? It's not a quick answer. You know, it's not like I have the magic pill. It may be a process. And eventually, but it's always been my experience that eventually people will find what is calling them. I have great faith in that calling in all of us, something greater than the rational mind and the human ego.
Yeah, very true. Very true. And so, you know, I'm going to put your details up at the end of, you know, on this.
Thank you.
Yeah, on the Zoom call so people can find you. And I mean, we've answered most of the questions that I wanted to go to. There's one that I can't resist here, even though it's going back a little bit in time, is what we've already talked about. But you talked about Andrew Harvey, and one of his, a quote from him, which was to follow your heartbreak. And if you could just expand on that a little bit, because it's just a beautiful line.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's one way that people find their calling is, you know, it's not a rational mind thing. It's like follow the heart, follow the heartbreak. And people who are doing great service in this world, and you know, that's relative. To some people it's great, to other people it's not so great. But some of my heroes and sheroes who are doing wonderfully compassionate things in the world are people who have followed their heartbreak. And one person I'm thinking of in particular is my friend Jill in the United States, who she's a friend of Andrew's as well. And you know, many years ago, she followed her heartbreak to just start taking in some abused and neglected animals. And it wasn't a hoarding thing. She was very careful about it, but it became a calling. And now she operates this phenomenal rescue facility outside of Chicago, which is fantastic. And, you know, there are many, many stories like this of people who follow their heartbreak and I have to do something about this. I have to. I think that's one of the reasons that I pursued this friendship with a homeless man and was able to sit with him, because my heart was broken. And, you know, it's like I could give him money, and sometimes I did give him some spare change. But what I think I gave him that was just as valuable is being able to sit with him and be humbled by this experience and you know, just go beyond myself, go beyond my ego. And it changed me. It really did.
Yeah, so those are the invitations that are sitting in front of us in this time, you know, in this horrible, beautiful, terrible awakening time that it is. And look, just to finish, I suppose, Carolyn, I don't think that we can live in these times as they are and not be taken to a personal edge somewhere. So I'm wondering what your edge is at the moment, with the edge that you're walking personally in these times.
I think it is what we talked about before of, you know, people of a certain age like to have a quote unquote security and know that they'll be moderately, reasonably comfortable for a while, and they're not going to become houseless themselves. And so my edge is this volatility around me in terms of the climate, which we're all facing to some degree, and not knowing where the next wildfire might erupt or when it might erupt, and what that will mean for me, and where will I live, and not being able to have the answers. I might have some clues, but I don't have answers by any stretch. And the vulnerability that I feel in that, that could happen at any time. I hope it doesn't happen in the middle of the night, but it could. I've got my car packed with a go bag and other things that I would absolutely need to survive, but I might lose everything else. And so it's a vulnerable, unknowing place to be.
And I think it's so good you say that. Because it seems sometimes that people talk, when they talk on these issues, it's like they've reached a place beyond their vulnerability, and that is just not as I see it, and certainly not as I feel it in you. And we're all, it's a great leveler, this situation, isn't it? We're all drawn down to the same degree of not knowing together.
Right. And, to give up the illusion of there's a place that's going to be safe for me. A lot of Americans think, I'll go to Mexico because the people are so wonderful and it's really cheap, and, their climate isn't that bad right now. And, or New Zealand or somewhere in Europe or wherever. And there's no safe place. There's no safe place. There's no place where you won't feel vulnerable, where you can feel like, okay, I'm out of the woods now. No, it doesn't exist.
That's a beautiful place to leave it, Carolyn. I feel like that particular thought can take us a long way inside, really. Into the questions that need addressing and into the feelings that need to be felt. So I don't want to sort of plaster on top of that anything that'll take away from that. So thank you so much for your work, and for the conversations. It's just such a delight for me to be talking with you and to be able to dive into these conversations. And my hope is I certainly benefit from them, and I hope that people listening to them do as well. So thank you, Carolyn.
Well, you're very welcome. And thanks for having me. And, it's such a refreshing place when I talk with you, because you're asking me questions that really matter. And it's unlike many other interviews, where people just don't quite get what we're talking about. And so I really appreciate your questions.
Oh, thank you, Carolyn. That's good for me to hear. As someone with no background in this at all, that's very satisfying. So many thanks. Thank you, Carolyn.
Thank you.